The clock above the door ticked softly, counting down the final minutes of Ted Bundy's life. Inside Florida State Prison, the air was cold and still. Outside the walls, hundreds of people gathered in the darkness, their faces lit by flickering candles and flashing cameras. Some shouted for justice. Others just wanted to see history end. Inside, Bundy sat in his cell, staring at the gray wall in front of him. In less than an hour, he would walk his final steps to the electric chair. He was pale, quiet, and trembling, though he tried to hide it. The guard opened the small metal door on his cell and said in a firm voice, "It's time." Bundy didn't speak. He just looked up, his eyes blank. As the guard unlocked the chain, Bundy stood slowly. The sound of the metal clicking echoed through the hall. The prison was silent, except for the buzz of the fluorescent lights above. Every guard, reporter, and witness knew what was about to happen. Bundy's hands were shaking as they cuffed him. He took one deep breath and whispered something under his breath that no one could hear. Then the guard began to lead him down the long, narrow hallway toward the execution chamber. The sound of his footsteps on the concrete floor echoed with every step. Outside, the crowd was chanting louder now. The world was waiting. Bundy walked toward his fate. But what was going through his mind in those final moments? What brought him here, to this cold hallway on death row? How did a man once described as charming and intelligent become one of the most feared killers in American history? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning of his final days, when Bundy first arrived on death row, thinking he could still outsmart everyone. When Bundy was first brought to Florida State Prison, he acted calm and confident. He told reporters that he would find a way to appeal the decision. He believed that he could delay the inevitable. The guards, though, saw through his calm. They noticed his sleepless nights, his pacing, his talking to himself when no one was around. Even on death row, Bundy wanted control. He smiled at the guards, asked about their families, and acted polite, but everyone knew what he had done. Some guards refused to speak to him at all. Days turned into weeks. Bundy spent hours reading and writing letters. He kept a notebook beside his bed filled with names, drawings, and strange notes about the cases. He gave interviews to journalists, trying to explain his actions. In some, he blamed others. In others, he hinted at crimes no one had ever linked to him. Every word he spoke made the world listen, even when people didn't want to. One of the strangest things about Bundy's final days was how he still believed he could control his fate. He talked to his lawyers daily, convincing them to file one more appeal, to find one more reason to delay his execution. Each time, the court rejected his requests. Every letter that arrived carried the same message. The end was coming. By now, the news had spread far beyond the prison walls. Reporters from around the country flew in to cover the story. The media called it the end of an era of evil. On the morning before his scheduled execution, the crowd outside grew massive. Some held signs that read "Justice for the Victims." Others just stood in silence, waiting. Inside the prison, Bundy's behavior started to change. He stopped eating. He stopped talking. He spent most of his time lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling. The guard said he looked like a man finally realizing that there was no escape this time. The night before his final morning, a priest came to visit him. The two men talked quietly for nearly an hour. When the priest left, he looked shaken. Then came the early hours of January 24th, 1989. The guards walked the hallway outside his cell, preparing the chamber. The electric chair, nicknamed Old Sparky, waited in the next room. The witnesses had started to arrive. Reporters were setting up their cameras. As the lights flickered for a moment, Bundy looked up at the ceiling. A sound came from the hallway, the steady click of approaching boots. The guards were coming for him. And when the door opened, everyone knew the time had come. The heavy cell door creaked open, and 3 guards stepped inside. The sound of their boots echoed off the concrete walls. Ted Bundy stood slowly, his face pale, his hair messy from a sleepless night. The lead guard gave him a small nod, the kind of nod that said it's over. Bundy didn't fight, didn't speak. He just stared at the floor as the chains clinked around his wrists and ankles. The walk from his cell to the execution chamber was short, but every step felt like a mile. The hall smelled of disinfectant and metal. Bundy's breathing was shallow, his eyes darting to the small windows along the corridor. Behind one of them, witnesses stood waiting. Some were victims' families. Some were reporters. Some were law enforcement officers who had spent years hunting him. They all wanted to see the same thing, an ending. Outside the prison, the crowd had grown even larger. Hundreds of people filled the field beyond the gates, waving homemade signs and holding cups of coffee as they waited for sunrise. Some chanted, others sang, a few prayed. Camera crews set up their lights, ready to capture history. It was part news story, part eerie celebration. Inside, a priest walked beside Bundy, whispering quiet words of prayer. Bundy nodded politely, but said nothing. His lips trembled once, just slightly. When they reached the final door, the guard stopped. One of them asked softly, "Any last words before we go in?" Bundy looked up, his eyes tired. "I'm ready," he said. His voice was low but steady. The guards pushed open the thick door to the execution chamber. It was colder than the hallway. In the center of the room stood the electric chair, wooden, old, and worn from years of use. Leather straps hung from the arms and legs. Reporters stood behind a glass window, notebooks ready. Witnesses whispered quietly among themselves, waiting for the moment they had imagined for years. Bundy was led to the chair and gently seated. The straps went around his wrists, then his chest, then his ankles. Every movement echoed in the room. The pull of leather, the snap of metal, the hum of the lights above. Bundy closed his eyes for a moment. When they opened again, he looked calm, almost too calm. The warden entered, his face expressionless. He asked the same question he asked every prisoner before the end. "Do you have any final words?" For a moment, Bundy said nothing. The silence was thick. Then he spoke, his voice just above a whisper. "Tell my family I love them." He glanced toward the witness's window, but his eyes didn't linger. There were no smiles this time, no charm, no performance, just a tired man at the end of everything. The priest placed a hand on Bundy's shoulder and stepped back. The warden nodded once to the technician. Behind the wall, a hand reached for the switch. Outside the prison, the crowd had grown restless. They chanted louder, some shouting for justice, others waiting in quiet suspense. The first hint of daylight painted the horizon, and the air buzzed with tension. Inside the chamber, the witnesses held their breath. A faint hum filled the room. The sound grew louder. Then, all at once, the lights flickered. The air cracked with energy. A bright flash filled the space for a split second, followed by silence. A guard checked Bundy's pulse. The room stayed still for several seconds that felt like forever. Then the doctor nodded. It was over. Outside, the crowd erupted. Cheers, tears, applause. Noise filled the air like thunder. Reporters rushed to their microphones. Cameras zoomed in on the rising smoke above the prison roof. Someone began chanting again, "Burn, Bundy, burn," and others joined in, their voices echoing through the early morning. But even in that noise there was unease. Some people couldn't celebrate. They stood quietly, staring at the prison walls, thinking of the victims, the young women who never came home, the families who would never heal completely. For them, this wasn't victory. It was just the end of a nightmare. Inside, the guards removed Bundy's body from the chair. His head slumped forward, his face pale and still. The same man who once smiled for cameras now sat motionless, the calm mask finally gone. The guards covered him with a white sheet and rolled the stretcher out of the chamber. The echo of their footsteps faded into the long hallway. But that wasn't the end of Ted Bundy's story. Not yet, because after his death, something strange began to happen. Across the country, police departments started receiving letters, phone calls, and reports. People claimed to have new information about missing women. Cases that had never been solved, names that were never linked to Bundy before. And when investigators began reopening old files, they realized something chilling. The number of Bundy's victims might be far higher than anyone had ever believed. The morning after Ted Bundy's execution, Florida State Prison was unusually quiet. Reporters had packed up their cameras. The crowds outside had gone home, and only the sound of guards' boots echoed through the empty corridors. But beyond those walls, Bundy's name was still everywhere. Across America, a headline screamed, "Ted Bundy executed." News anchors spoke his name with a strange mix of relief and horror. The man was gone, but his shadow wasn't. Within hours, investigators began sorting through boxes of Bundy's notes, letters, and taped interviews. The FBI had collected everything he'd said in the final weeks of his life. He had spent those last days talking to agents, confessing to crimes no one had ever connected to him before. Each new confession opened a new wound. There were names of women who had been missing for years, families who had been waiting for answers that never came. Now, finally, they were beginning to understand the truth. Bundy had confessed to more than 30 murders, but detectives believed the number could be much higher, maybe double, maybe more. His words were vague, sometimes cryptic. He remembered the faces, the cars, the cities, but often not the names. The details were scattered like broken glass, and the investigators had to piece them together one by one. In Seattle, Salt Lake City, and Denver, old case files were pulled from dusty shelves. Police compared Bundy's confessions to missing persons reports, crime scene photos, and timelines. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. Every city had the same story. Young women, all around the same age, vanishing near universities or parking lots. The way they disappeared, the way the crime scenes looked, it all fit. The more they uncovered, the more chilling it became. Bundy had traveled across states for years, always staying one step ahead. He changed cars, changed names, even changed how he looked. It was as if he had built his life around being invisible. What made it even more disturbing was how ordinary he seemed. Neighbors described him as polite. Co-workers said he was charming. Even friends said he was helpful. No one suspected that behind the smile was a man who could commit such horror. As the weeks passed, the FBI created a full profile of Bundy's crimes. They built timelines, charts, and maps with pins marking every possible location tied to him. The map stretched from Washington to Florida, a path of terror cutting across the country. The realization hit hard. Bundy hadn't just been one of America's worst killers. He had been one of its most organized. Meanwhile, his story began to spread across TV shows, newspapers, and radio. People wanted to understand why. How could someone who looked so normal, spoke so kindly, have done these things? Psychologists, writers, and reporters all gave their opinions. Some called him a monster. Others said he was proof that evil could hide behind a friendly face. Inside police stations, though, the mood was different. Detectives who had chased him for years couldn't celebrate. They sat in silence as the reports came in. More victims, more heartbreak. For many, it was personal. They had met the families. They had seen the photos. And now, even after his death, Bundy was still haunting them with his unfinished confessions. One afternoon, a package arrived at the FBI office in Quantico. Inside was a small box of cassette tapes, recorded interviews from Bundy's final nights. On one of the tapes, Bundy's voice was calm and almost polite as he described how he chose his victims. He didn't sound angry. He didn't sound sad. He sounded cold. The agents listened in silence. When the tape stopped, no one spoke for several minutes. Outside the building, reporters waited for answers. They wanted numbers, names, details. But the truth was bigger than anyone expected. Bundy's crimes had reached farther and deeper than the public knew. Some victims might never even be identified. As night fell, a storm rolled across the East Coast. In a small office, an FBI agent pinned one last photo on the board. A missing woman from Oregon who had vanished years before. Bundy had mentioned something about Oregon on one of the tapes. The agent stared at the photo, wondering if this was another victim, another story that would never fully be told. Even in death, Bundy's name refused to fade. His crimes had changed the way police track serial killers. They led to new systems, new technology, and new ways of sharing information across states. But for many families, none of that could undo the pain. The nation had seen justice, but not peace. And as investigators continued to uncover Bundy's final secrets, one thing became clear. Some nightmares never truly end.